Hello, and welcome to the first video in our series on converting units. In this video, we're going to talk about the types of units and what makes up cups, pounds, grams, ounces, things of that nature, and where can we use them interchangeably, or can we or can't we? So what's the difference between weight and volume? Well, I like the old joke, right? What weighs more, a pound of feathers or a pound of bricks? They weigh exactly the same. They're both 1 pound. The difference comes in the volume, right? You're going to get, like, one brick is going to weigh 1 pound, but you're going to need a lot more than one feather to make up that 1 pound. So the volume, or the area that it encompasses, is going to be much larger, right? Are weight and volume interchangeable? The answer is sometimes, right? Sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, and we'll get into that as we go through here. Which measuring tools do we use to measure weight, and which ones do we use to measure volume? Well, for weight in the labs, you've used digital scales. That's the most common thing out in industry today. Back when I started out, digital scales were expensive, so we had spring scales, and basically it was a large dial with a hand on it, sort of like a clock, and a spring. You would set whatever you were weighing on top of the spring, it would depress and it would move that arm. The problem with those is over time the spring would wear out and they would become less accurate. The other way what we can use for measuring weight, and you'll see bakers doing this a lot, is they'll use a balance scale. So they'll put a 1 pound weight on one side of the balance and put whatever they're weighing on the other side of the scale. And then when that balance beam balances, you're even, right? You've got your 1 pound. Bakers will use that for portioning dough and things like that because it's a quick, fast method. Less accurate than the digital scale, but still practiced today. As for volume measurements, there's a bunch of them out there. I mean, you've got cups and pints and teaspoons and tablespoons. Ladles have, the volume measurements on them, whether they're 2 ounces or 4 ounces. Or how many milliliters they are. The Cambro containers that we use have volume measurements along the side, how many quarts, how many liters, those sorts of things, right? So the next slide we have here is just some of the abbreviations for some of the common measurements that we use. Most of them should be pretty standard to everybody there. The one I like to point out is the pound sign here because it's not a hashtag. We're not tweeting or, hashtagging people. That's what that symbol used to mean, is pound, right? So there's pounds, and the other way you'll see it written as LBS. So there's a couple of different abbreviations for that one, right? So as I mentioned before, when I asked if weight and volume were interchangeable, and I said sometimes, right? So water is sort of the golden rule. It's interchangeable. 1 pound of water equals 16 ounces or 1 pint. 1 cup of water equals 8 ounces. Anything water or water-like can follow this rule. The moment it changes is when the viscosity changes. So what's viscosity? Viscosity is the thickness of the liquid. So think about molasses. It has a higher viscosity than water. It's thicker. It weighs more compared to its volume measure, right? So we can't say that 1 pound of molasses is equal to 1 pint because it's thicker, it's more dense, it's heavier. The 1 pound to 1 pint or 1 cup to 8 ounces applies to anything that's water or has the same or similar viscosity water. So we're talking stock, we're talking wine, we're talking milk, things of that nature. When it doesn't apply, we're talking about things like molasses, oil, cream, any liquid that is not the same consistency as water. So if we go back to the abbreviation table, which I'll bring up here in a second, we'll look at which of these units are metric and which of them are imperial. Now, most of you came up in school with using the metric system. I know I did, so I'm sure you folks should. So these are our metric measurements, right? So milliliters, liters, grams, kilograms. Those are metrics. We're going to use a lot of the imperial measurements, and that's these guys here, right? Because they're so prevalent in our industry, you folks need to know how to convert them. There's lots of recipes you're going to come across that are calling for a tablespoon or a teaspoon or a cup or a gallon or whatnot, right? This is the more difficult conversions, and there's a lot of memorization that goes into converting these units. And I'm going to show you some tricks on how to do that in the upcoming slides. If you remember the metric, that was all based on tens, hundreds, thousands, so pretty simple to convert. We will do some of that as well, but throughout the course, we're going to focus more on the imperial units, so you get used to how those are converted. So the first trick to converting units I want to show you is the magic box. So the magic box is a chart which allows you to know how many of what goes into what. For example, we've got 8 ounces in 1 cup. If we look at the chart here, 8 ounces, number of ounces in 1 cup, right? Top to bottom. Obviously 1 cup is 1 cup. So if you notice, there's a pattern here. So number of cups, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. It's doubling every time, right? Number of ounces, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. They double every time. So I always recommend, if you can remember the part I've just put in red here, you can easily figure out the rest of it. So if you just remember that there is 8 ounces in 1 cup, and you remember that this chart goes from cups to pints to quarts to half gallons and then gallons. The chart works really well if you remember that half gallon. If you don't have that, then it sort of messes up the pattern. But if you can remember cups, pints, quarts, half gallons, and gallons, and remember that 1 cup has 8 ounces, you can draw out this chart anytime if you're doing an exam on a scrap piece of paper, because every one of these doubles, right? So there's 2 pints in 1 cup. There's 4 quarts, or four cups in 1 quart. There's 8 cups in a half gallon, and there's 16 cups in a gallon. There's 8 ounces in a cup, 16 ounces in a pint, 32 ounces in a quart, 64 ounces in a half gallon, and 128 ounces in 1 gallon, right? So cute little box that you're going to need to memorize. This is information that you need to know when it comes time for exams. If you go in to write your journeyman exam, you're not going to be allowed to bring any formulas or cheat sheets or calculators with you, so you need to memorize this, right? The next slide I'm going to show you is another slide that you have to memorize. Now this one, if you memorize all the conversions on this slide, you'll be able to do any converting between metric, imperial, and so on, right? So the first thing to look at here, there's 3 teaspoons in 1 tablespoon, 16 tablespoons in 1 cup, 2 cups in 1 point, etc. I'm not going to read the whole chart. But the thing to notice here is we have 5 milliliters in 1 teaspoon, right? So, for example, if we know there's 5 milliliters in 1 teaspoon and there's 3 teaspoons in 1 tablespoon, we can easily figure out that there's 15 milliliters in 1 tablespoon, because 3 teaspoons added up is 15 milliliters, right? So this is a basis of doing all of your conversions, knowing that there's 28.3 grams in 1 ounce, right? Now, one thing to watch, down at the bottom here, we have this 33.8 ounces is 1 liter. Because the fluid ounce is slightly different from the weight ounce, we use 33.8 ounces equals 1 liter to do any of our convertings. And we'll have some examples when in the next couple of videos when I show you some different methods on how to do the converting. But for now, just make note and work on memorizing these formulas, right? You should know there's 1,000 milliliters in 1 liter, right? There's 1,000 grams in 1 kilo. Those should have been ingrained to you back when you're in your elementary days, right? But the big ones for you now, for most people, are going to be the teaspoons, the tablespoons, the cups, the pints, the quarts, the gallons, etc. Okay? Memorize this one, memorize the magic box. It'll make your work so much easier, and recognizing how they compare to each other, which one's bigger and which one's smaller, right? The next thing we need to talk about when we're talking about units is temperature, right? Because we have Celsius and we have Fahrenheit, and we use both of those in the kitchen quite regularly, right? Our ovens are in Fahrenheit. Our temperature of the day outside is in Celsius. If you go to Europe, your ovens are going to be in Celsius. So you need to know how to convert backwards and forwards, right? So the basic formula, and there's a couple of different methods on your screen right now. I suggest using the second one and remembering the 1.8, subtracting 32, and then dividing by 1.8. It's just less steps. It's less things to remember. So for example, the one on the screen there, converting 212 degrees Fahrenheit to Celsius. Now, if you're smart and you've done your baking and you recognize that 212 degrees is the boiling point of water, you know you're looking for 100 degrees Celsius, right? To figure it out mathematically, we subtract 32 and then we divide by 1.8 and we get 100 degrees. The way I recommend remembering these steps are that Fahrenheit is generally, and I say generally because there's a point where they come together and they're the same, minus 40 Fahrenheit is minus 40 Celsius. But most of the temperatures we deal with, Fahrenheit is going to be a larger physical number than Celsius. So if we're converting from Fahrenheit to Celsius, logically we should be expecting a smaller number, right? In the case of the example that I'm showing, 212 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Celsius. Does that follow logically what we're thinking? Yes, because Fahrenheit is generally a higher number. If you ever watch the news from the United States and they're showing the weather forecast and they're in the high 90s today and you're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to melt. That's because Fahrenheit is generally a higher number than Celsius, right? Except when you get down to that minus 40. So that's converting from Fahrenheit to Celsius. In the next slide here, we're converting from Celsius to Fahrenheit, and now we're expecting a bigger number, right? Now this time we do use the same factor, the 1.8 and the 32, but we use them in a different method. In this one, we need to multiply times the 1.8 first, and then we need to add the 32. So in the example, we've got 150 degrees Celsius to Fahrenheit. We're going to multiply the 150 times 1.8, and then we add the 32 to Celsius. An interesting little trick that I try to remember is the 32. How I remember that number is 32 degrees Fahrenheit is freezing. That's 0 degrees Celsius. Those two are the same, right? So that's how I remember that. Ooh, we got an extra slide in here. So as I mentioned, all those charts and numbers that I just showed you, you need to memorize those ones to be able to convert units. Now, through the course of our course, I expect you to have a cheat sheet and you're constantly looking back and forth to those. I can't control what you're doing with online exams, but if you go for your journeyman papers or your Red Seal, you will need to have those memorized or you're going to be lost, right? The best way to memorize them is to practice, practice, practice. I supply a lot of practice questions through the course. If you do those, you're going to get better at it. I always compare doing math to learning other skills in the kitchen. Knife skills, for example. I guarantee you the first time you picked up a knife, you were terrible at it. You couldn't cut a straight line even with a straight blade, right? But with practice, you got better at it. The same thing goes for all the math that we're going to do in this course. The more you do, the more you practice, the more you'll understand and you'll be better at it, right? And again, you can't convert units without any of those memorized conversion factors, right? The 3 teaspoons equals a tablespoon. The 28.3 grams equals an ounce, right? Okay, that's the end of this slide. And the next slide will be talking about the different methods that we use to convert units.